Hello and welcome to Buy Africa, the show where we focus on investment opportunities around the continent. I'm Tap Omudiba. Thanks for joining me. Tonight I'm joined by Ronak Geopolis, Head of Country Risk at Rand Merchant Bank, for a closer look at the changing geopolitical landscape and what it means for the continent. Ronak, thank you for joining us firstly. Geopolitics, my favorite subject. It's a boring time right now for that, isn't it? Certainly last time we spoke, we sat here and the world thought Hillary Clinton was going to be president, and probably the landscape would be vastly different. Where are we? Do we know where we are? What does it mean for the continent?
As they say, what a time to be alive.
Yeah.
Last year was really the year of wildcard scenarios. We had from Leicester City winning the Premier League to
which is an important observation, yes.
To Brexit, to Trump winning the election. It was really the year of surprise, shock outcomes, and now we're sitting in very ambiguous and uncertain terrain. We're sitting in an environment where the leader of the free world is advocating greater protectionism, whilst the leader of the Communist Party in China is advocating greater globalization.
All right, I have to pinch myself when I listen.
Exactly, it's very ironic, and we're in really uncharted territory. We've got a whole bunch of questions around the political arrangements, the institutional arrangements, the business arrangements that have existed since the end of the last World War. Does the traditional liberal Western global order still stack up or not? It's a great time to be in country risk doing what I do, but not a very, very happy time for the globe in general.
Right. I guess the starting point is, and you've touched a little bit on this, do we have a clear sense of what US policy is going to be? And then leaning from that, can you then strategize as to what is going to be the outcome of that?
So we really need to decode Trumponomics, as I call it. At this stage, it's very speculative. Everybody expected the rhetoric pre the election to turn into something more presidential, and that really hasn't been the case so far.
Yeah.
And if you decode Trumponomics, they're competing kind of end goals, right? So you've got, on the one hand, this pro-business agenda, which is seeing the Dow reach dizzy heights, and then you've got this insular, anti-globalization, protectionist, make America great kind of approach that you're seeing being advocated.
Right.
And they're competing. So there's the good element of Trumponomics, which is fiscal stimulus, infrastructure spend, lower taxes, pro-business, and that's what markets are buying.
Yep.
And then there's the dark side, which is more insular, trade wars, currency wars, and we don't know which of these competing tensions is going to win.
Right.
You look at the administration so far, it's been haphazard, policy making has been erratic, there's a lack of consistency. So all we can do is sit here and speculate at this stage.
Right.
But these are the kind of two competing tenets of the policy agenda. And it remains to be seen which will be the more dominant one.
Okay. Let's assume the second is more dominant and increased in protectionism does occur. Is Africa going to be a target there or a beneficiary from that?
So, look, the most likely scenario in that event is trade wars, currency wars. In my mind, in both the good or bad scenarios, Africa doesn't emerge particularly favorably.
Okay.
And I think we need to take a step back and understand why that is the case.
Okay.
Trump operates from a purely return on investment paradigm.
Yeah.
He's a deal maker, he's marketed himself as such, and unless Africa can offer something to Donald Trump in terms of trade, investment, or there's some agenda there, it's not really going to feature on his agenda. So the continent's economic, geopolitical, and geographic value will be shaped by this paradigm. Now, if you look at it at face value, Africa, 2% of America's global trade, not particularly important. So I would assume a policy of benign neglect more than anything else. It also depends, if they go the protectionist route, will it be targeted at certain sectors? Things like manufacturing, we don't manufacture a lot in Africa, so impact kind of muted.
And that's where his focus has been on American jobs and manufacturing.
Yeah, but I think broadly speaking, I see a strong dollar, which can't be good for the African continent.
Right.
If the fiscal stimulus drive happens, if there is higher growth, higher inflation, it means the Fed has to intervene with interest rates. Typically, what that means is that there's capital migration to the developed world into safe haven assets like the US dollar, emerging market risk aversion, which means that there's currency weakness,
low commodity prices,
which is not a good look for the African continent.
Right.
So, I think in any event, the continent's policymakers need to be on their toes, need to be looking at all kinds of possibilities and scenarios. The external environment has changed dramatically over the past 3 years or so. And I think what we need to do is start seeing African solutions to African problems.
Does this period under which there's increased uncertainty on the US front mean that we are likely to see the African continent gravitate towards other large trading partners like China, potentially like India going forward, or Europe for that matter?
That's a great question, and I think there's an immense opportunity here for policymakers on the continent.
Right.
But to play the economic diplomacy game, which there are ample opportunities for with Brexit, with TPP, being exited under an executive order. There's with China exerting a more muscular stance in terms of globalization. There are a number of opportunities which can be exploited favorably. But what the continent needs to realize is that it needs to speak with one voice, because Africa's power is as a collective.
Right.
So it's only by speaking as one voice that you gain the gravitas, that your population size, your demographics, your urbanizing middle class, your consumer market becomes relevant in the greater scheme of things.
And how likely is that to happen, though?
Well, I mean, at this stage, South Africa, Nigeria, Egypt, the continent's 3 largest economies, are kind of preoccupied with domestic issues, not doing particularly well economically either. The AU chairperson was recently appointed, so we'll wait to see what direction we go in that regard. But Amina Mohammed, who is a candidate, was very shrewd and adept at playing this economic diplomacy game as Kenya's foreign secretary. The other thing that the continent really needs to prioritize is regional integration. We're a continent that consumes what we don't produce, and we produce what we don't consume. Intra-regional trade is around 10%. We export 80% of what we produce. And like I said, the external environment has changed dramatically with our major trading partners all going through various issues. So regional markets and trading with each other is going to be a definite priority. And then, like you said, there's opportunity to pivot for Asian countries to pivot towards Africa, to exploit the fact that China has a vested interest in the continent, that the UK are looking for more favorable deals as a result of Brexit. So it's a space that I think needs to be managed with a level of clever diplomacy, with innovation, and with some commercial savvy.
Given where we are then regionally within the continent, is there any pocket of the continent that's better placed to weather whatever storm comes up, or actually even benefit from that?
So, I mean, commodity producers have taken a beating over the past few years.
Sure.
East Africa has been a net beneficiary of that, as net commodity importers rather than exporters. But I think we are in a situation where sentiments towards the continent has deteriorated, and it hasn't been helped by policy own goals. So we've seen countries like South Africa, the finance minister reshuffling, countries like Nigeria waiting 6 months for a cabinet. These things don't help matters when sentiment is already weak towards the continent. We're living in a world now where capital is scarce, where there's a lot of risk aversion. So countries need to differentiate themselves and market themselves in such a way that they're going to be able to attract the scarce foreign capital. And just too many countries on the continent are not doing that well enough. So, as much as we are in ambiguous and uncertain times, I always have the view that you should never waste a good crisis. There's always opportunity to be exploited, and I think we just need to think in more creative and innovative ways on the continent, because amidst this changing geopolitical world order, this vacuum that exists, there's potential scope to exploit these opportunities.
If we drill down to, I guess, specific countries, are any countries putting up their hands and saying, we're re-looking at policies, we are being creative, not wasting this crisis, as you say? I mean, we've seen elements of that coming out of Zambia as an example. Are we seeing that any broader?
So the one country that kind of stands out for me was Kenya. The way, given the geographic location, they've marketed themselves as kind of an investor-friendly country, and they've played China off against the US. India's had an active interest. Japan held their Africa summit there last year. So as a kind of business hub and a gateway into the rest of the continent, I think under the leadership of Amina Mohammed, they did very well. And they were very clever in terms of maximizing their benefit as a result of how they marketed themselves. A country like Mauritius over the past few years has also been trying to pivot towards Asia, given the fact that their traditional trading partners in Europe have been undergoing kind of more depressed economic times. So, I think nimble, innovative economies and policymakers are going to do well in this kind of environment. But I think, definitely there is opportunity to make the most of the situation.
Okay, so I guess listening to what you're saying, we're in a very elevated country risk environment. How, if you put the very difficult question, if you put your 5-year, 10-year hat on, how does that picture evolve? Does that trend then on the continent change towards the positive, or are we going to remain at these elevated risk levels for some time?
So like I said, the external environment, we're getting no favors from the external environment anymore. And I think this could be the impetus we need as the African continent to get our own house in order. So to actually say we need to prioritize regional integration, we need to get our own house in order. We are not an industrialized continent. We need to do that. And ultimately it's about survival. So with no get out of jail free card anymore, I think this is the impetus for policymakers to say that it's now or never. We shouldn't waste these opportunities to diversify our economies, to make these structural changes that we need to in order to really be globally relevant and competitive. Otherwise, it looks pretty ominous.
Thanks to my guest, Ronak Gopaldis, Head of Country Risk at Rand Merchant Bank. That's all from Buy Africa this week. Remember to follow me on Twitter. That's @Mudiba_Tepo. And follow Ronak at Ronak Gopaldis to send us your thoughts about the show using the hashtag BuyAfrica. From myself and the team,